I'm going to show you my framework for planning a backpacking trip to Europe. I've made some mistakes in the past that you might want to know about, and I've also found some nice resources that make the process a lot simpler. And I know it can be difficult for planning a trip like this, but if you take these steps, it'll be a lot easier than going into it blindly. So let's get started. Okay, number one. First, you got to figure out when and where you're going to go. If you don't know where you want to go, it's really nice to be able to go to YouTube or even Instagram and find out where some other people may have gone that you would like yourself. When I first started traveling, I used to look at Ryan Shirley's videos, and I also watched Rick Steves' videos because Rick Steves would go into the detail of each individual country and each individual site with some history and some backstory. And I really liked Ryan Shirley's videos because he has some nice footage and he goes over so many different areas within the same country. So if you watch those two people, I think you're gonna get a great grasp of where you might want to go. But other than those two people, I don't really look at a whole lot of other travel things. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of boring, but I really like those two guys and what they do, so they've been good enough for me. For when to go over to Europe, my number one rule for myself is to never go during the summertime. So pretty much from June till the end of August. And that's because there are so many people in Europe during the summer months, and it's going to be really crowded and it's going to be really expensive. I made a previous video about how much it cost for me to go to Europe for a whole month. And in that video, I talked about how going in the shoulder season is just a win-win for you because there will be less people there and it'll be less expensive, so you're having a better experience for less money. And another thing to consider whenever you're doing a trip to Europe, especially a backpacking trip to Europe, is whether you want it to be fast-paced or slow-paced. And there's really no wrong answer there. It really just depends on who you are as a person. Let's say you have just 2 weeks or 3 weeks to go to Europe. You know, you may want to go on a fast-paced trip to where you're jumping cities every 2 or 3 days just to see everything you can. And that's what I did one time, and I really don't think there's anything wrong with that. It gets a lot of hate, but it's really nice sometimes because not all of us have months and months on end to travel. And another tip for deciding where and when you want to go is don't be afraid of the lesser known towns or the lesser known areas. For instance, from my trip in the past, I stayed in a town called Levanto, Italy, which is north of Vernazza, which is a very popular tourist destination. I stayed there because I thought it might be quieter and more of an authentic Italian experience, and it really was. I got to meet and eat breakfast with the owner of my accommodation, and it was a really cool cultural experience because he showed me all the cool areas around town, and I got some really nice food recommendations from him. So now that you know maybe when and where you want to go, let's go and book the flight. When choosing flights, I like to go to Google Flights, and that's probably something you already know about, but it's a really convenient tool where you can say the specific dates that you want to go, and you can make the map on the screen, the area on the earth where you want to go, and it'll show you the different flight prices for each city you would be flying into. So it really makes for a good way to choose where to go. As for the timing when to get your flight, I do it at least 3 months ahead of time. You really don't want to be booking your flight 1 month away from your trip that you want to go on because it'll be really expensive. I've seen prices go up $500 just from a couple weeks of waiting. So just check the prices periodically and be ready to jump on something if you want to buy it that day. So now that you have your flight booked, let's move on to accommodations and attractions for your trip. So some people recommend you book your accommodations before you go, and some people suggest that you book your accommodations as you go on your trip. I like to book at a minimum the first week's accommodation of the trip, especially the city where you're going to be flying into and seeing first. Also, the city that you're flying out of, book the final night of your trip so that it's safe and you have it already. But other than that, whether or not you book your accommodations before your trip or during your trip, it kind of just depends on how long your trip is. For something like a 2-week trip, I would definitely book all of them before I depart. And if you're going for a month or more, I would recommend booking your accommodations 2 weeks ahead of time. So let's say you're a week into the trip you should have your 3rd week's accommodation booked. This is just because hostels and budget hotels can fill up pretty quickly. Even in the shoulder season, they can fill up a few weeks out. For instance, some of the hostels where I'm going, they were almost booked up and it's around a month away. So just something to think about. If you're going to be staying in hostels, I recommend browsing them on Hostel World. It's an app where you can browse all the different hostels in the location and on the dates that you want. 90% of the time, it's going to be cheaper to book directly on the hostel's website than booking on Hostel World, because Hostel World gets a commission for every booking that they get from the hostel. Also, the earlier you book a hostel, the more likely that you'll have the lower number of beds in the bedroom still available. So some hostels will have 4 beds per bedroom all the way up to like 20 beds per bedroom. That's another reason why you want to book at least 2 weeks ahead of time. I found that budget hotels, especially in the shoulder seasons, they are really economical and they may be a better value than hostels. From my experience, a lot of budget hotels will be 10 to 20 euros more per night than a 4-bedroom or 6-bedroom hostel. And you're probably going to be renting a towel in a hostel for minimum 3 euros. So the price difference really isn't that drastic, and you get a whole lot more privacy and security in a budget hotel. And on top of that, it's even better if you get to know the owner of the hotel, like I got to in Levanto. So for Airbnbs, personally, I think Airbnb is a little expensive for a backpacker, because just looking for my upcoming trip, a lot of them were like 120 euros a night plus all the fees. So it really averaged out to like $140 a night, which isn't really in the backpacker budget. So now that you know where you want to go and you have your flight booked and you have maybe a couple weeks of the accommodations booked, let's move on to the essentials that you would need on a backpacking trip to Europe. Number one that comes to my mind is a phone plan. Whenever I go to Europe, I use a service called Airlo, and I talked about it in a previous video, but basically you just get data while you're over there from the cellular towers. You don't get a phone number, but I found that that's not an issue because you can just use WhatsApp in Europe. For transportation, the trains are gonna get you everywhere you would want to go in Western Europe. So this brings up the question of whether you want to buy each individual train ticket or if you want to get a Eurail pass. Pretty much it comes down to price versus convenience. On my trip, it cost a little bit more to get the Eurail pass because you have a bunch of seat reservations for the high-speed trains, but the Eurail pass did offer a whole lot of convenience and flexibility on where I wanted to go. So if you're on a trip that's super impromptu and you figure it out as you're going along, you might want to get the Eurail pass because it'll be a lot easier for you to just hop on and off a train. But if you're going for just 2 weeks and you know exactly where you're going to go, you should probably just go ahead and book the tickets beforehand because it'll come out to be cheaper. So now that you have your phone plan and train tickets taken care of, let's move on to just the random essentials that you'd need as you go across Europe. I'm gonna make a much more in-depth video later, so definitely subscribe, but basically some of the things you might need are going to be a travel charging block, because different continents and different areas have different charging ports. And if you're staying in hostels, an absolute essential is to buy a padlock or two. And I recommend getting one of a medium size and one of even a little smaller size, because the locks aren't all the same size in the hostels. Another thing to get before you go is a way to back up your photos. And for probably 99% of people, this is just going to be an iCloud subscription. iPhones nowadays, if you have them connected to Wi-Fi and you have them plugged in overnight, they'll automatically back up the photos to iCloud if you set it up correctly. So definitely do that before you go, because you don't want to lose your pictures in the middle of your trip. As your trip gets closer, you probably want to learn a few simple phrases in the language of the area you'll be visiting. I made the mistake of not learning some simple German phrases before I went to the countryside of Germany, because I thought everyone was just gonna speak English fluently. I don't really know why I thought that, but I did, and it was a mistake. But that is something that's really cool about travel. Just being able to go to another place where you can't communicate with another person, it's just so cool. And it's one of the reasons why we should travel. If you need to know how much it costs to go on a backpacking trip to Europe, watch this video that I made. I wrote down every single expense on my trip, no matter how small, and the grand total may surprise you. I also give practical tips on how to keep your costs down as you go. So if stuff like that is something you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe, because I post videos like this just to share what I've learned, and hopefully it'll help someone along the way. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next video.